Hi, my name is Gwendolyn Downing. I go by Gwen, and my pronouns are she, hers. Welcome to this introduction to insidious trauma. During this video, we'll go over the definition and some of its possible impacts, and some ideas for what one might be able to do. Some information, disclosures, and disclaimers. The handout link is in the video description, or you can find it on the Connect All website under the Materials and then the Event Materials tab. I am the originator and director of the Connect All initiative, and the initiative has 501(c)(3) fiscal sponsorship by We the World. Any sources used are not endorsements of the source. As recognized, information is what it is and may be constantly evolving. This training is being provided for informational purposes only, and it's being done as part of WE's annual Manifesting the Dream in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King's Day of Service and 40 Days of Peace. It is being done with partial support from an AmeriCorps grant, and I'm receiving nothing for doing this. And as I am doing this as part of the Dr. King event, I have a Dr. King quote I appreciate from his 1963 I Have a Dream speech. To remind of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. And for me, this quote isn't just for this topic, it's for all in need of it. And before we get into the definition, just a little bit on self-care. Because this is about insidious trauma, some of the material I cover may create responses in your body's behaviors, thoughts, or emotions. And when I say emotions, there are situations, such as with alexithymia, where individuals truly aren't going to have, experience, or identify emotions the same as others do. And then even if this wasn't about trauma, we all have internal and external factors creating responses in our bodies, behaviors, thoughts, or emotions. So please do whatever you need to do to practice the best self-care you can. And if you need to, in the handout, there's a mindfulness other section on pages 5 through 8. And then if you need help, link to hotline numbers on page 4. And there's also a link in the description to a PDF from the website that has all that same information. Okay. So let's define insidious trauma. And to begin, we're going to define trauma. And the definition for trauma I'm using comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And they have the 3 E's of trauma. That the individual trauma results from an event, series of event, or a set of circumstances. That an individual experiences as physically, mentally, or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that may have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So now let's look at the definition for insidious trauma. And you can find this definition at VAWnet.org, and it's part of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And I'm going to take a breath because I want to do this well. So insidious trauma is the daily incidence of marginalization, objectification, dehumanization, intimidation, etc., that are experienced by members of groups targeted by racism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, sexism, and other forms of oppression, and groups impacted by poverty. Now, this term was coined by Maria Rood in 1992 and really gives us an anchor point to work done before and since then. And we're going to explore the definition a bit, starting with these terms. Marginalization, to relegate to an unimportant or powerless position within a society or group. Objectification, to treat as an object. Dehumanization, to deprive someone of human qualities, personality, or dignity. To subject to someone to inhuman or degrading conditions or treatment. To address or portray someone in a way that obscures or demeans that person's humanity or individuality. Intimidation, to make timid or fearful, especially to compel or deter by or as if by threats. And oppression, unjust or cruel exercise of authority or power. And now I have some have you ever because of reflection questions. And I'm going to do an overview and then ask you to take time to go through them and reflect on how they may apply to you, individuals in your life, and others. So, starting with the three have you ever questions. Have you ever been afraid of what might happen, including what might not happen? And with that, it may be that you're afraid that others might respond negatively or hurt you in some way, or maybe is that you won't or can't get what you need. Sorry. I do have a cough drop. I'm a little congested today. So then the second question, have you had others act in a way you didn't like, such as be mean, avoid you, or not care? Obviously, with be mean, we could use other words. Avoid you. Maybe someone actively goes out of their way to not acknowledge you or maybe to not interact with you. Not care. Maybe you're in a place of being invisible completely, or others are aware of you and they still just don't care. And then the third question is experienced any other injury of any type, such as bad water, bad air, no food or bad food, not getting any type of care you need, experiencing disasters. And obviously, there are a lot of people who could answer yes to all three of those. Here's the key, it's because of. So, on the because of side, we have how much money you don't or do have, the color of your skin, or anything about your physical appearance that others would identify as part of a racial or ethnic group, where you live now or and lived before. And with that, you may immediately think of maybe immigrants or refugees, but it can also be people stigmatized by their geographic location, like maybe they're from that side or area of town, or anything else that has to do with where you've lived. Um, you appear male, female, or other. You have or look like you have a disability. And I always acknowledge the issues regarding the term disability for some of the areas it's applied to. Your age or the age you appear, the way you dress or make your physical appearance that would identify you as part of some group, what gender or genders you're attracted to, and other. And when we think of other oppressed groups, as an example, maybe that might include someone with a certain mental health diagnosis. So there could be other pieces as indicated in the definition. And when I say other pieces, sorry, I should have finished that sentence. Other pieces, parts of our identity that meet that definition. So now I would ask you, for any of the reflection pieces of this video, to pause the video and to take the time you need to go through the reflection. And for this one, to reflect about how this might apply to yourself, individuals in your life, and others. And then continue with some reflection questions. What was something that stood out to you while going through the definition or definitions? And what was something that stood out to you while going through the reflection? Okay. So now we're going to look at the possible impacts of insidious trauma. Pardon me. And we're going to go through 4 points in this section: the social determinants of health, the impact of trauma, allostatic load and weathering, and moral distress and secondary traumatic stress. And I have 2 slides before we get into those 4 points. The first one is, before I talk about the possibilities, I need to state not everyone all the time. Everyone has their personal factors and circumstances. And within that, there can be intrinsic factors, adaptive factors, protective factors, so many different pieces. And even if it looks like something is headed a certain way, like we are experiencing this, we know that trajectory isn't determination. So we just kind of want to keep that in mind as we're going through some of these possible impacts. And then continuing with how we're all individuals, we want to keep in mind who we are in context. So again, everyone has their personal factors and circumstances, and that's as part of our individual ecological systems. So there's who we are as the individual, and maybe we have a family. And I have family in quotes because some people may not have family, or maybe who they identify as their family is different from how someone else would identify a family. Then we have family, and if there's a child in the family, their communities. So this could be where I work, where my child goes to school, different social groups we're a part of, maybe faith groups we're a part of, anything that's part of our daily, weekly lives. Then providers, and providers is a very broad term. It could be your doctor, your school teacher, the grocery store clerk, anyone that you're interacting with in any type of service area. Community, again, this goes from into an array. It could be your neighborhood, your town, your state. And I live in the United States, so I'm using language for my geographic area. It could be my nation. It could be my global community. All of those things can have an impact. And then my physical environment. What is the land, the air, the housing, all of those different pieces. And when we're thinking about our ecological systems, we want to keep in mind that there's an interconnection. So using insidious trauma as an example, insidious trauma is coming within and through, the sources are coming within and through the ecological system to the individual. And then the impact on the individual is going back into the ecological system. And so whenever we're thinking about ourselves or others and what makes us us in any given moment, we want to think through what has and is happening in their lives, and that everything is happening within this context. Okay. So then with one area in our ecological system to think about with insidious trauma are the social determinants of health. And we could talk about drivers and other frameworks, just using this one as an example. And the social determinants of health I have up comes from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So the social determinants of health are broken down into healthcare access and quality, neighborhood and built environment, social and community context, economic stability, and education access and quality. So examples might be safe housing, transportation, neighborhoods, racism, discrimination, violence, education, job opportunities and income, access to nutrition foods and physical activity opportunities, polluted air and water, language and literacy skills. So when we think about so we want to think about the sources of insidious trauma and how they may be sources or contributing sources for any issues with any of our social determinants of health. So for example, is my housing list safe because of insidious trauma? Insidious trauma sources. Sorry, I'm bumbling a little on this one. But am I not receiving the quality of education I can receive because of insidious trauma sources? Just as we go through each of these areas, how might the sources of insidious trauma impact them? And there are multiple publications on how that can be the case for these areas. So then moving from an example of external impact, we're going to look at an example of possible internal impact by looking at the impact of trauma on individuals. And this example, again, comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And I'm not going in depth. I do entire trainings on trauma. So it's very interesting to just give a brief snippet here. But when we look at the impact of trauma on individuals, it can happen in multiple domains, including emotionally, behaviorally, physically, developmentally, cognitively, interpersonally, and spiritually. So since we're talking about insidious trauma, the impact of insidious trauma can be impacting individuals in all these different areas of who they are. And so now we're going to consider allostatic load and weathering. So allostatic load, and I'm going to break these terms down if you aren't familiar with them. We want to start with what homeostasis is. And homeostasis is basically that everything in who we are, our being, is stable and working the way we want it to. So we want to be in a place of homeostasis, right, as much as possible. But we do have different stressors. And when I say stressors, there can be positive stressors. So we're obviously talking about negative stressors. We can have negative stressors in our life that take us out of a place of homeostasis and put us into allostasis. And allostasis is the body's way of trying to do everything it can to get us back to homeostasis. However, we might be going through a lot of repeat or chronic stress. And when we do that, our body can't get us back. And that stress starts adding up into what is referred to as allostatic load. And that can start creating physical and psychological issues from that load. And as we consider the definition of insidious trauma, the daily incidents of marginalization, objectification, dehumanization, intimidation, and so on, we can understand how insidious trauma could definitely contribute to an allostatic load. And then we have the term, and now we have the term weathering. And weathering, the original term was from Arlene Geronimus in 1992, is chronic exposure to experiences like racism can lead to earlier health deterioration. And that it can be both earlier health conditions. So maybe these are things we would normally see as people are aging, but we're seeing it earlier than we'd expect. And also early death. And so we can definitely understand how weathering could go with our definition of allostatic load and how insidious trauma interacts with is connected to this term. And the last area I'm going to discuss as part of possible impacts is how insidious trauma can be part of moral distress and risk factors for secondary traumatic stress. And I'm going to start by defining what I mean by those two terms. Pardon me. Sorry. Not what you want when you're recording a video. All right, so back on track. Moral distress. Moral distress is stress that occurs when one believes they know the right thing to do, but institutional or other constraints make it difficult to pursue the desired course of action. So let me give you a couple examples. Maybe I want to do the right thing by my partner or my child, but I can't because of systemic issues. Or maybe I'm in a work role and my personal morals are to be a benefit, but the system I'm working in or some law that interacts with that system conflicts with that. And, the definition has making it difficult, but it could even be impossible to do. And we start feeling this moral distress because of that. So then we have secondary traumatic stress. A secondary traumatic stress is where we're experiencing symptoms that are similar to, and at its most severe meets the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And we experience those symptoms due to being indirectly exposed to another person's direct traumatic experiences. So I didn't personally witness what happened to them, but maybe they're telling me their story, or maybe I'm reading a case note about it, or maybe they're showing me pictures as they're telling me about it. So it's an indirect exposure to their direct trauma. And these secondary traumatic stress can impact children and youth and adult. It's not, there's no age limit with this. So, your child could have secondary traumatic stress from hearing from their friend what they've been going through. All right. And to discuss how insidious trauma can be a risk factor for moral distress and secondary traumatic stress, I'm going to use two slides adapted from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network curriculum, Understanding the Impact on Professionals in Trauma-Exposed Workplaces. Even though it has the word professionals, I am going to make this where it applies to anyone who might be experiencing secondary traumatic stress, or applies to anyone for this topic. So going back to our definition a little bit, the daily incidents of marginalization, objectification, dehumanization, intimidation, so on, experienced by those I'm connected to and work with can create moral distress or secondary traumatic stress. So when I say connected to, that could be my partner, my child's friend, my colleague, so on, anyone I'm directly connected to, or someone I'm working with, and that includes any formal role, including a volunteer. And maybe I'm not working with someone directly, but I'm the person who processes all the paperwork. I'm still working with someone. And so I can still have an impact from the things I'm reading and taking in that way. And or also for moral distress, it may be I'm not working directly with people, but I'm working in some kind of role, again, whether paid or volunteer, that I could have moral distress because of what's going on. And then we want to remember with this point that one may be both personally experiencing insidious trauma as well as having moral distress and secondary traumatic stress from those they're connected to or work with. And then there can be additional vulnerabilities connected to secondary traumatic stress with if there is any part of my identity or circumstance that is part of the group that can experience insidious trauma. Those additional vulnerabilities, some examples are maybe I identify with an individual of a similar identity or having similar experiences. Maybe I'm being asked or feeling compelled to contribute expertise about my marginalized identity. And I always feel the word identity is weird because I have one identity. There's just lots of different parts to it. But some people use identity and identity. So that's my own little note on that piece. But that I feel that I need to, or I'm being asked to, or being pressured to contribute expertise on that. And then just having a greater load than others can make me more vulnerable. So those are kind of our quick overview. I know all of this has been very quick. Look at insidious trauma with how it's connected to moral distress and secondary traumatic stress. So we have covered, not everyone all the time, trajectory is not determination, that we have this ecological system that's our context, the social determinants of health, the impact of trauma, allostatic load and weathering, and moral distress and secondary traumatic stress. And so some reflection questions. What's one thing that stood out to you from what we covered? Thoughts on how being aware of the possible impacts can be a stressor in itself. Thoughts on how this ties to creating physical and psychological safety for ourselves and others. How much hope there is in us doing better as individuals and as society, and the need for the urgency of now. Okay. So now let's look at what can we individually do. And I have 2 slides of ideas we're going to go through. So we can start with ourselves. We can look at our own biases, our blind spots, our behaviors, so on. And even if we're experiencing insidious trauma in any way, there may be areas we're also unknowingly contributing to. So we just kind of want to keep that in mind, that one doesn't exclude the other, and do that self-reflection piece. We want to have a lens of how might insidious trauma be a source or contributing source to whatever this individual is experiencing or exhibiting. So when we're thinking about others and what's going on with them, how does that interplay? And we also want to have that lens for ourselves too, right? Practicing the best self-care we can. And that may mean learning more about self-care, including ways to mitigate secondary traumatic stress. And I do entire 2-day trainings on that topic. So obviously we didn't go through that in this video, but there are some sources in Appendix A you can look at. It may include reaching out for help if it's safe to do so. And that can be a big step for people to try to reach out for help, especially if in the past that hasn't gone well. But that is one option that may be part of our self-care. Learning more about the issue. This was obviously just an introduction, And on a personal note, I have more in-depth trainings for community and professional groups, and I'm continually learning more. So I don't consider this a in knowledge at this point. It's kind of a journey of knowledge with this. Creating well awareness, helping others understand the issue and possible impacts. And kind of with that, as we're creating awareness, advocating for change. And if possible, look for partners who are already doing advocacy work and team up for, and that can help you team up for greater impact. Um, then we have incorporating work we're already doing. So if we're part of any group, maybe a parent group, a neighborhood group, a business group, a social group, any type of group we're a part of, how can we bring this into that? Or maybe we're part of a specific initiative, like maybe we're working on trauma informed change. And if you're like, what is that even? In Appendix B, there's some sources about trauma informed change. And then lastly, and not lastly, but last on this list, is safety. We want to think about how insidious trauma interplays with creating physical and psychological safety in environment, practice, and policy. And this could be a whole lot of time in itself. But we can do this as we consider our home, our businesses, our neighborhoods, our systems, our fields of work, and just, all these different parts of our lives. Pardon me. And here are some examples we may want to consider is we want to question things like what insidious trauma sources are present in, whatever the area this may be. And if you work in a field that is evidence-based, what is evidence-based based on is a really important question, and not just the surface answer you get, but going a little deeper and finding out where that comes from. Um, Looking at setup, things like the physical location, hours, cost, languages, accessibility, what's a physical setup, are materials accessible? And on that note, I understand I did not do this video in the handout to 100% accessibility. I am doing the best I can in my circumstance, and hopefully I will someday have the resources to do better. Pragmatics, things like food, transportation, childcare, and even just the culture of these different things. Are we supporting self-care? Do we have a supportive environment? What's the culture? What are those norms and expectations that can help us with this? All right. And then one last thing before we wrap up. We're going to watch a short video, The Monkey Business Illusion from Daniel J. Simmons. It's about 1 minute and 41 seconds, and then I'll have some reflection questions after. So give me just one moment. I need to pause and switch over, and I'll be right back.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, You often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
So then follow-up questions to that video. I mentioned blind spots quickly earlier, and blind spots is sometimes it's not that we're biased against something, we just haven't paid attention to it. It's a blind spot to us. So we may have blind spots such as we've been missing this altogether, but also, like in the video, we might have been focused on a single or a couple of the sources of insidious trauma that those were our gorillas, and we've been missing the other sources, the other things going on too, and how it can all be tied together. And then the second question is what are some sources of insidious trauma we might not recognize yet? And think about the ones included in the definition. What did it take for someone to say they were wrong? Then how long did it take for enough people in a society to actually start to address them to whatever extent we have? How recent do we have laws, practices, policies, degrees of societal change, and acknowledging that some of those changes may not be right? Don't we want to be thinking about this now? What are the things we're missing? Thank you so much if you've made it all the way to the end of this video. If you're able and like to financially support the initiative, the donation link is on the website, or you can text Connect All to 202-858-1233, and take care.